Thank you, Sean. I mean, it's fantastic to be back at Napier. As Sean said, I graduated here in 1993 as probably Scotland's worst site engineer, so it's great to be back in a new capacity, as they say. I think Sean gave me quite a nice introduction, but I think I'd rather point out sometimes, the reality of sometimes what it feels like. I think when you speak to people about BIM, it's seen as this magic snake oil, it's a cure for everything. And I think in terms of giving my backstory, I think it was probably about 2006 that I started to really understand what BIM was. We're over in America, and at that point, the GSA, the General Services Administration, were about to start their mandate program. And they were using BIM, you could argue at a prosaic level, to try and understand how many assets do I have, how many courthouses do I have. And I saw it was very much an intelligent 3D model to try and help the design process. Fast forward a couple of years, and it's very much for them now about how they can make that asset more efficient and how they can drive efficiencies through it. And I think for me, that's the thing. In the last couple of years, it's been very much about trying to sell BIM as that magic snake oil. But I generally hope, and I hope tonight we've gone beyond that. It's not about how do we start to drive BIM forward. And I think for me, what's tonight about is starting to socialise, the government construction strategy and how that relates to BIM in terms of reform, how we're really trying to reboot construction, if you like. So the first part of this lecture is really the macro drivers for BIM. Why are we starting to do this? Why is it so important to Cabinet Office and government? Well, I kind of think when I was starting to look at the theme for this, I kind of went back to my old high school days at Stirling High, and there we had this motto, Temporium Parendum, and that kind of meant to me, I always remember, be prepared for your time. I kind of think that's what it's about with BIM. That's the theme for us. We've got these rich technologies, but it's also about new ways how we interface with data and how we try and change how we work. And I think every good story, usually at this time of night, I'm actually saying my daughter's good night story, and I think it always starts with a once upon a time. And you look back not that far ago at our industry, and it was very much a case, well, let's be honest, we kind of lived in that 2D world, and it was quite good, wasn't it? We all kind of had that healthy portfolio. Our designers got a good fee, I'm sure, all the time. We had a well-rehearsed supply chain that was kind of always predicated on those best value solutions. And then kind of overnight, the industry changed. We started going into that war economy. Well, what does a war economy mean? It means we've got to get longer out our assets. We've got to be more efficient in how we manage them. And the harsh reality is, in terms of both CapEx and OpEx, we've got to squeeze that real down. So the construction strategy came out, especially I mentioned BIM, it was very much BIM in the context of industry reform. How do we change what we do? And it made life a bit easier for me. This, if you like, is the pool. We've been told, in terms of central government, by 2016, we've got to achieve fully collaborative BIM. So it kind of makes life easier in terms of having to sell it. And I feel like that is the pull. But really, what really you want is the push. BIM should be about push. And you kind of look back, the last 100 years, at least in terms of construction, take something like laying the bricks. Has it changed so much? Some degrees, I think, in terms of safety and sustainability we've got there. But you look in terms of pure productivity compared to other industries, especially automotive, who have taken 3D data sets straight to manufacture, you've got to ask, could we have done better? And I was at a conference last week, and one of my colleagues started to socialise this slide for it. And you start to look at how the cost in terms of construction has actually went up and compared to others. There's a trend we've got to actually start to change. We've got to start improving productivity. And BIM for us is a key catalyst in terms of how we do that. I remember speaking at a conference 2 years ago, and I had this slide. Are we going to do, is BIM going to be something that we'll actually do and take seriously as an industry? And it's quite funny, being in the Cabinet Office, we still get a lot of correspondence that says, are you still going to be, why are you doing this? Is there still real value in terms of BIM, And I think one of the questions you do here is, there's this heuristic bias. That this is probably the biggest barrier, I think, to BIM is, we've been doing this for 20, 30 years. And there'd have been better, we would have found it by now. And it's that trying to change the behaviours, and that's kind of the challenge for BIM. And you kind of think, well, what's the alternative? Do we keep building once on site and then having to strip it down, rebuild several times with all that waste, all that inefficiency that we know is there? And you kind of think sometimes it's actually immoral what we do. I think you pick up every week, there's some new publication that tells you that, BIM is going to take you so much more efficient. There's all these great numbers and quantum, but there's a lot of skepticism, there's a lot of hype around about BIM. It's not a silver bullet. You can't just buy some technology and have BIM. There's a lot of facets to it. But it's time to sort of move on to that conversation. And I repeat the same message that we had 2 years ago. We certainly don't think BIM's a fad. You know, we're mandated this by 2016, but it'll keep growing and growing and expanding beyond that. And the technology platforms, I think, are at a point now where they are mature enough to support what we're after in terms of level 2 BIM. And I think what we're starting to witness in the industry, and I think perhaps that's about tonight, all these people in the room to talk about this subject, we're starting to witness that tipping point in motion, an industry change. And I think we're also starting to see a cultural shift as well. We're starting to move away. You know, I think BIM has been around in a long time, very much, if you like, in terms of, you know, the eager enthusiasts, the protagonists, mainly from the technology background, that have been really driving it. And I'm sure there's a few people in the audience that might recognize themselves in the slide on the left. But I think at last, we're starting to break BIM out of these silos, and we're starting to think about it in terms of core business strategy. We're starting to see more and more business leaders come along to BIM conferences, trying to understand how BIM can help shape their business objectives. You can argue, we were actually talking about this before we came in here, BIM in terms of technology has probably been around for 40, 50 years, for some extent. You know, so why is it taking us so long for change? And I think it's a simple case of, well, we didn't have to. We didn't have to change. The chap up on the right-hand side is called Andrew Wilson-Holm. He's now the Chief Executive of Crossrail. Andrew wrote a report a couple of years back called Never Waste a Good Crisis. And Andrew's assertion was, industry has not been good at innovation because we simply didn't have to. We're protected very much by that economic comfort blanket that meant you could get out your bed in the morning, you could go and make your margin without thinking. This current economic crisis means we are trying to have to think again. In terms of that reform, we're talking about 20%. And that's maybe a good thing. If this had been 2-3%, how do we achieved it? We went out to our supply chain and said, take your price down. 20% in terms of reform means having to think differently. So a bit like Joseph, the quote's off now. We've really got to start thinking about how do we actually innovate. So we start thinking about BIM from the Cabinet Office is very much about how do we get new innovation, new ideas, new value propositions by using data-rich technologies. And I always get to think, you know, this is a real moment for us to try and shift the construction industry, like nudge it to the right, a real paradigm shift. And I must admit about it, I'm sure most of the folk in this room, they want to be involved with it. They don't want to miss this one opportunity we've really got. And I think perhaps this is, you know, once in a generation. So you can argue, if you look at the backstory of BIM, I think we've got the perfect storm for it. If we are going to innovate and change it, it's going to happen now. This is the perfect climate for BIM to happen into. So you've got to say, well, you know, fine, but what actually is BIM? You know, I think it's sometimes a misused term. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. The one I kind of like, you know, BIM enables everything we do, and that is everything during the development, that whole project life cycle to model digitally, and that's right through from briefing, right the way through that whole project life cycle to be modeled and to start driving performance improvement during each phase of that. But the real value is BIM is not just doing a model, but it's then starting to socialize the model, starting to share that with our colleagues, our various consultants, our clients, and start to make decisions from that data. And really, when you start to think about BIM, it's not a term I sort of appreciate, but it's one globally still understood. We're really talking about collaborative project delivery. And I think that's key. We saw this at a slide I kind of looked at. There's probably two concepts as well. You've got little BIM. And I think little BIM is the thing that most people talk about. Very much BIM in that context of design and construct. There's still a value proposition in there, but the real value for BIM is when you start to look at it in terms of big BIM. Validate, and the validation part of BIM is a big thing. You start to validate it, it becomes more robust, you can get better learning, better lending, you can start to get client surety on their assets. But the big value in terms of BIM is in that operation and maintenance. I think we've been guilty as an industry of concentrating too much on the design, construct, and trying to squeeze that down, rather than talking about the questions of how do we get a better performing asset. So two concepts, big and little BIM. But there's also a case of you hear people saying, we're doing BIM, and I think there's probably 3 levels of BIM I always see. You've got level 1, if you like. I'm the consultant that's got the product up my shelf, I've done a nice 3D model, but am I sharing it? There's little value from that. What we're trying to do at this moment in time is collaborative BIM. We call that level 2, starting to bring the models together, start to share it, start to get value, start to drive outcome from BIM. But where we really want to get to, if you like, we're not there yet certainly, but it's that full integration. You know, you could argue, you know, where is BIM in that model? Well, we like to think BIM is the music. It's that musical strip. It's the common language, the common data set. It's about bringing people together, the FM team, the designer, the contractor, the supply chain, starting to make decisions together in an integrated manner. And for me, I think the simple analogy, I think BIM is a unique coinage. You know, it's two sides of the same coin, if you like. On one, if you like, on the head side, it's maybe BIM in terms of data-rich technologies, but on the other side, it's very much the cultural side about sharing that integrated design, construct, and more importantly, the operational side of it as well. And people say, is BIM new? Well, I don't think so. The simplest assertion for me is we've been doing BIM for many, many years, and it's, at its core, it's about value-creating collaboration. You bring people around about a campfire, you start to discuss things, usually great things start to happen. Well, how does that relate to BIM? I think for me today, suddenly the model becomes a campfire. You start to bring your teams round about it. You start to be more productive. You know, you start to share the ideas for that week ahead. Can we actually build what we set out to do? And we can virtually prototype it. We can validate it through these data-rich models. And you kind of think, do we want to stick to the old way of doing things? You know, are we going to achieve 1%, 2% best in terms of margin? Or for a contractor, do you start to try and take the waste out of the process? So when we're thinking about BIM, we're starting to think, can we take waste out of it by building better before we build? If we build this 2, 3, 4 times virtually, and once on site flawlessly, we can start to take that waste out of the process. And you start to look at the value propositions. And I remember in the days, when we're doing a lot of school design, you take a design to a client, you take this lovely 2D drawing that you understood. I think design intent's a bit like Scottish poetry to some extent. Always sounds really pretty, but do we really understand it? And I think that's the case in the 2D world. The client often thought, I'm getting that thing down the bottom left, nice sort of building. And the reality was we're actually getting that because they didn't really understand the design intent. And for me, BIM helped start to tell that story a bit better. If you like the snowflake principle, every design's that bit different, but BIM helps you tell that story. And clients start to get the assets they really wanted. In terms of coordination, I'm sure there's a few, and I thank the people in the room for giving me these slides from their jobs, which is really good. But you could argue if you had that 3D environment, would you have put that lamppost there? You can start to explore it, you can start to validate that bit better. I'm sure we all recognize, maybe not as exaggerated as these, but these things do happen in our life. I think it always comes back to, BIM is a bit as a value proposition, it always comes back to risk to some extent as well. It can help us de-risk in terms of what we do. The job on the left, if you like, I think it was, I'm trying to remember, the Alaskan Viaduct, large road job, and BIM's not just about our buildings, it's about the big linear infrastructure jobs, just as much it is about our built assets. This job was going to take about, from memory, a year and a bit to try and sell the design intent to the public, so they started to understand what it looked like, all the turnpikes in the junction. And then somebody said, actually, we've got a 3D model that we can start to socialize that a bit better so people understand. And what they saw is people could understand it a bit quicker. The time started to come down. They then put it into a 4D construction simulation. It got to the point where a bright young student says, why don't we put it into an Xbox or such, and people can actually drive through it? And the time for that validation came right down from a matter of years to a matter of months. Today, where it actually sits on an iPad, that people can actually drive through it, they can start to understand that design intent that bit better. And I think we can start to even use it in real time as well now. We can use these 4D simulations. We start to infuse it with the risk register. You can start to validate in terms of, this is what I plan to build. What happens if I put that extra tower crane in? What happens if we get adverse weather in? You can start to do all these what ifs. You can start to de-risk it. And you think if you're measuring BIM, one of the key measures for me, I think, is the risk pot, the contingency. And you can start to use these data-rich technologies to walk your way right through that whole job several times to get that optimum risk-analyzed schedule. I'll not take you all the way through it. I think also it's about bid-winning data sets. I think there's been some fantastic press coverage about BIM of late, saying people are starting to win jobs, big jobs, because of BIM. And I think that's a great story. Because I honestly would believe that 5, 10 years from now, contractors will start winning jobs, not because they're the best at laying bricks or putting up cladding, but they've got the best data set. In fact, the data that's going to be the footprint of that building is going to run during its operational stage. So we get to the government. What is our hypothesis? Well, we think as a client that we can start to help drive improvements in terms of the cost. We mentioned the key value, cost in both CapEx and OpEx side. We start to improve carbon performance, especially in-service carbon. And how are we going to do that? That's through very much through that open, shareable asset information, the data set. We think there's real value. We want to become better in terms of understanding the value in the data. We want the industry to understand what we want to do with BIM. We also want to make sure this is general, i.e. non-proprietary. You want to be software agnostic. We aren't going to be going to a vendor and telling you to use that vendor. We still want to encourage competition in the marketplace. Open, verifiable. We want to have validation in terms of what you're saying you're going to give from BIM. We want to be able to audit it. We want that compliance. This is also for us a funded program in terms of research and the guidance that we're putting together. And we have a 5-year program set aside for getting to our level 2 BIM goal. As we mentioned, this is a 2-part strategy. It is very much push and pull. We showed the picture of the pull, if you like, i.e. we're telling you to do this, but we want to be good as part of that pull in terms of how we buy data. I think we're getting better at buying assets, but there's as much value in the data, if not more so, than there is in the physical asset. We want to be consistently good at that as well. We don't want to be different from department to department, but we want to leave that how to you, the people in the room, to get good at. We're also starting to do the push part as well with supply chains and delivery chains. And we're giving the early warning, hence the 2016. We want to give people time to get ready, especially in terms of training, and start to look at their methods and documentation that surrounds that. I hope many, can I ask a question actually? How many people in this room have read the construction strategy that came out last year? So I'd say that's maybe less than a third. I mean, that was a key document. It started to socialise what we want to do. And if I can get one thing out tonight, I would recommend you go on the Cabinet website and read the construction strategy. Unfortunately, it's not all just about BIM. There's other things in it. And BIM is just part of that rich journey. But what came out of it is we want by 2016, as you can see there, to achieve level 2 BIM, if you like. And level 2 BIM, we talk about full collaborative BIM, if you like. And you can see every good model, I think, is a triangle. We start to increase it. It starts to expand out a bit like the universe. I remember when I took this job up in BIM thinking, gosh, am I going to be doing this? It's going to take me to retirement. I think the reality is yes, but it won't be called BIM. It'll be called construction. 5 years from now, BIM will be part of how we work. It'll be part of our normal construction mythology, if you like. And when we talk about level 2 BIM, I think it's worth trying to explain what we do mean. We do mean, if you like, a series of domain-specific models coming together for a purpose. We're not talking about one single model, but it'll still be very much the construction team, the architects, all designers, the maintenance team, all aggregating the model for a purpose. So in terms of a lot of the commercial and legal aspects, level 2 BIM is largely fit for purpose with what we've already got. And I think there's always a case of, gosh, is this the big government steamroller going to come roughshod over us and tell us we've got to do this without any preparation? Well, I don't think we are. We said 5 years. The reality is, for me, the clock's ticking. It's 4 and a bit. I think it's kind of what I've been doing as a father as well. You're trying to get confidence, help them, get the momentum up. And I think the reality is we won't go from level 2 to level 3, full integration. We'll go through a series of ramp maturity. We'll start to validate. There'll be a series of stepping stones to help industry get those stabilizers off. Somebody said to me, well, is level 2 right? And I think largely it is. I mean, I'm sure most people in this room, in terms of what they're doing, can achieve intelligent 3D CAD models at this moment without any problem. So is level 2 BIM, is that right? Well, I think it is. I think it's challenging enough, not just for the main contractors and designers, but also for clients to start to get their head around as well. And hence the 5 years is to get the tail end up to speed. And I always think, it kind of comes back to always think you always need a good sort of astronomy or sort of astrophysics type model. And I think we talk about the Goldilocks zone and we talk about big BIM. Well, for me, I think there's a correlation between procurement route and being able to achieve big BIM, if you like. Little BIM, the design and dump, where a contractor's not been involved or the client's not been wholly involved, we know you're not going to get the big outcomes from it. If you like, the big BIM outcomes maybe fit at this moment in terms of 50% of the procurement route. So we've got to set very much the right environment for BIM outcomes as well. Back to government, what are the key things for us that we're trying to achieve? What are our values? It's very much this moment, trying to get that collaboration across the entire project lifecycle. As I said, this is about breaking out these silos. Think about project lifecycle, very important. We want to create a common language as well that everyone understands. We mentioned we think this is a great opportunity in terms of telling the story, but it comes back to efficiency, trying to be more efficient right the way through that project life cycle. We want to validate virtually as well. We want to understand how we are going to really get the asset we wanted, and we really want to drive innovation, if you like. We want to make people go faster than the 2016 mandate. And ultimately, we do really want to change industry in terms of that reboot. For us, BIM very much, if you like, the new black. I often meet a lot of people in the civil world that go, BIM? Well, I don't really do buildings. And I think for me, BIM is very much a verb. It is about building an information model, if you like. It's about doing, and I think we need to get that message out to industry. I sometimes think in terms of definition, it's easier to say what we don't think BIM is. We don't think it's just a technology. We don't think it's just 3D, and it's certainly not next generation. There's people out there at this moment really pushing BIM, and we're treating BIM very much as that change program. This is, a transformational program, and ultimately it's about the wholesale reform of how we build. Box at the top right, the reality is you can't go out there, just shop tomorrow morning and buy the big box of BIM. There's lots of different things that are involved with it. And I'll be honest with you as well, this is about disruptive innovation. There's a lot of things I think we've held dear over the years. We hold richly, all this rich heritage we've got with our institutions. We do have to start defying some conventions to make this work. Rip up a few plans and start again. I asked this question a while ago, if BIM was a cake, what ingredients would you put into it? What are the essential ingredients for your recipe? And I think I made a bit of a mistake when I put this up at the last time. The young chef in it, Jizzy Erskine, found out about it and tweeted, I got the thing, what does BIM mean? So the celebrity chefs out there have now got a real interest in BIM and what it means to them. And they think they'll be able to use it as well. So a good thing. But we said, well, what are the three ingredients in our BIM cake? We said, well, down at the bottom right, our flour, if you like, is very much the inconvenient truth. You do need the technologies to build the model. You do need an intelligent 3D model that's data rich. You also need to have process, and process is a big part of this as well. I sometimes think it should be maybe number one, and it's maybe the eggs, if you like. But we do have to start thinking about process in terms of that whole project life cycle. Make sure it's aligned with work plans and it flows right the way through start to end. I think if you aggregate the two of them up, that's maybe 40% in the equation. The big part, I've no doubt, for us is people, organisations. How do we train this workforce up for 2016? How do we change that? We mentioned that heuristic bias of we've been doing this for 20, 30 years, and we'd have found it by now. So I think for me, that's the big challenge. You bring those three things together, you start to get the base of your cake. It starts to build that spine, that integrated design, construct, and operate. And I think there's also, you've got your, if you like, your vanilla sponge. You've then got to put the icing on it. And for me, the icing, the big part of that, the big value in BIM is that single data set and the value that's got within it. We mentioned the inconvenient truth that for a lot of people there's investment that's needed, but the tools have a real value in terms of helping us visualize, make decisions, bring collaborative teams together and get these project outcomes. I think we're also starting to see not just the core BIM technologies, but the real value in the complementary technologies that surround BIM. On the left, you see a 3D laser scanner, which in a matter of seconds can scan via a burst of laser, create a point cloud, and give you a very accurate spatial image of a building. Very good for retained estate projects. And I saw something last week. It was the BIM forum out in the Washington, D.C., and the GSA, who we mentioned earlier, the General Services Administration, noted that they found an error, I think it was to do with a slab deflection, that saved enough money to fund an entire 10-year BIM pilot program. So the complementary technologies are very much a big part of BIM. We mentioned education. Education is a huge part of this. We're working in terms of our work groups to go through all the universities, all institutes, to try and understand what are they doing in terms of BIM at the moment and where do we need to be by 2016. And we reckon we've got about 3 million pupils to try and train up. And the reality is other countries out there are training up their pupils, their consultants in terms of being BIM ready. And I really believe that if we're not ready by 2016, what we'll start to see is we've got to start to import the skills in. At this moment in time, if we get ready, we've got a real opportunity in terms of UK to start exporting our design consultancies, our staff out to other countries. So it becomes much bigger than just the single project to start driving the UK economy. And I think the best one for me is going to be the Christmas cake. The earlier you start baking it, the more it's better it's going to taste. And I think BIM is the same. Go back to BIM in terms of the little bit BIM. If you start it during design and construct, you're really missing an opportunity. It really needs to start at the end in terms of the client defining their outcomes. And who gets the gravy? Well, I think we all do. It's a question we're often answered. Is it just the client? Is it the designer? Is it the contractor? And I think we all get a good share of it. What we're trying to do in terms of being a client, well, first off, we're trying to work with each of these departments, who are many, to try and make sure they understand where the value sits for BIM right through that project lifecycle. As I said, we've been guilty. Think in terms of design being a factor of 1, construction 10, the business costs, the operation and maintenance maybe being 1,000. The 10,000 is business outcomes. I think we've been guilty of designing it, building it, and hoping we get a certain outcome. With BIM, we've got a real opportunity to start working right for left. Start understanding the business outcome your client wants, the data set they want, and start to pull it down and push it through the whole BIM process. I think BIM is unusual for me as well. You start to look at BIM through the client's lens and say, well, what value proposition do we want? And you think at the end of the day, if we do get this right by 2016, we'll start to be able to have that asset information models. We'll start to know in terms of how many buildings we actually own, our square meterage. We start to understand what condition our estate's in as well. We can start to plan in terms of that whole life cost, building expectancy. It's all about the data set, though, the divinity of the data set. That's key to this, if you like. We want to start building the object libraries, intelligent objects that we can start to put into our buildings. Start to create, if you like, more, putting products together in terms of assemblies. And the other big part as well, you start to build these objects, it's very much data alignment. Start to manage these data sets. I don't think we've been that good at it over the years. We've got collaborative tools. Well, what did we do? We just kind of flung all our files in there. But BIM means we've got to start managing project information that bitty better as well. We mentioned the fact that clients are going to have a data set for 20, 30, 40 years, cradle to cradle, till the next asset comes along from. Clients now have to start thinking about how they nurture their geometry, because remember, this is level 2. We're maybe talking about 5, 6 models, that every time they change it, how do they make sure it aligns with the data set in it? So for clients, they're having to start to learn how they manage it. They've also got to understand, I get all this data, how do I start to turn that data into operational efficiency? And already we're starting to learn from others. We're starting to learn, especially from the retail sector. When you go buy your can of beans on Saturday, how do they, through electronic point of sale, start to turn that from information to knowledge, ultimately to wisdom that's going to influence their strategy, and especially in terms of supply chain. We also want, as a client, to become great at articulating our desired BIM outcomes. What do we actually want to achieve from BIM? What questions is it going to answer for us, and when? And we've given clear and simple guidance to industry in terms of how that should come about. But as a client, we don't want to become BIM experts ourselves. We're hoping that people in the room will rise to the challenge, will start that education process and be great at it. But we need to understand that where we as a client sit within that process as well, and we've got a key role to play in it. And we come back to that slide again, where does client sit? Well, I think clients may be the conductor that starts to bring the orchestra together, round about the same table, and helps them create that collaborative journey and sets the right environment. As we mentioned, this is about supply chain innovation. We won't be telling you how to do it. It won't be a case of this is how you do 4D, this is how you do clash detection, this is how you do quantity takeoff. It'll be very much about setting targets and objectives for BIM, what we want for it. We also hope this is going to be very symbiotic in terms of the journey as well. It's not just a case of government saying to industry, this is how you do it. There's a huge amount of BIM learning. And the way we're tackling this, if you like, is we came up with 6, we call it push groups, where we'll listen to industry. We're listening to the main contractors, the SMEs, the product manufacturers under the delivery supply chain, all chaired up by the UKCG. We hear their voice. We hear we share what we've done with them. We've got all the institutions together, the CIC, to make sure in terms of plans of work, we start to get some alignment. We mentioned technology is a big part of this. We've got all the vendors together under one umbrella as well. We hear what they're doing. We start to help shape the decision they're moving products in. Operational supply chain, the people that actually manage these assets, we've got them into the room as well, so we start thinking in terms of big BIM, making sure we can deliver through that operational stage. Training education, making sure so we can manage to train those 3 million people. We've got It's a massive part of it. We've got a working group for that now to start pushing that on. Media liaison, well, why have we got in there? We've got to start sharing the success stories as well. We've got to start measuring BIM as we start on the journey and getting those messages out there into the industry. And I think that's what tonight's kind of about, starting to socialise, starting to get the message out. We're also establishing for each department an onboarding programme as well, starting to get their journey from, if you like, almost 0 up to 100, starting to build, if you like, a maturity ramp for them in terms of what outcome, how many projects by year. We also want to set the pace for industry as well. We want to, in terms of government, set that cadence. What speed do we want to go with, hence the 2011 mandate level 2? But we really hope that industry, the leaders, will push us and go even faster than the mandate. We're starting to see people doing that already, starting to get outcomes that exceed where we want to go. If we set the speed limit at 50, we expect to see private sector especially pushing well beyond that. We kind of see two types of business. Maybe unfair with saying the Sony and Apple. I think every presentation needs a good Apple analogy in it. Well, what's Sony? It's incremental innovation improvement. And we start to see the apples. It's something that we didn't even know we wanted. How you actually interface with data, back to little BIM and big BIM. And that's what we're hoping that industry will start to achieve, starting to go for the real big BIM. We also mentioned that this is just part of the construction strategy. Other task groups out there as well, data, cost benchmarking. We're trying to make sure we get consistency of approach, that the data set that we specify here will fit for purpose with all other task groups as well. We also want to be a great client, and we know that's something that's really up to us to set the right barometer, i.e. when you come to us, and it's a collaborative BIM job, we set the right environment in terms of the procurement route, and we set the right rules as well, that people can come and play in a nice, fair, collaborative climate. And that's key to BIM success. Big part as well is we want to facilitate the operational, the FM soft landings. How do I get all my geometry, the data from the design and construct into the operational side without having to fling it over a wall and hope somebody catches half of it with the big net? Big part as well is, fine, a lot of is in the operational side, but we also want to better enable the design and construct as well. We want to realise that 20% efficiency, and we want to see how industry is going to take the waste out of this. Creating a model in itself doesn't take waste out. How are people going to use a model to start driving productivity, reviewing it, taking lean paradigms into it, to start driving that 20%, to try and take that waste out of the whole process? We also think we've got a great opportunity not to miss as well. This is about safety. We mentioned validation. Well, we can start to validate in terms of our outcomes for construction and indeed operating that asset as well. Can the man or lady get round to actually change that air handling filter? We want to see how people are going to use BIM in terms of safety to make sure we get safe assets. We think that's very much the moral imperative. We also see this as a launch pad for level 3. We want to start building up. It's a mature plan. And what we do know is we won't always get it right. In industry, we might bend a few nails, and we are going to hear a few sob stories along the road, but we think the bigger picture is certainly worth it in terms of what we've got to do. So what does the plan look like? Well, we mentioned we kind of had takeoff already with the government construction strategy. What we've done since then is established the BIM steering group. And we've started, if you like, we've started to move on the rest of the year. We've got 18 work packages that deal with such things as the legals, the contractual side of BIM. And we've got those 6 push groups that we mentioned established up and running. And we're now working individually with each department to try and help them on their journey, trying to make BIM work for them. What are we doing next year? Well, that's us starting to get those pilot projects, starting to build onboarding programs, starting to get BIM flowing through the pipeline. And the first packages will help to get them off the ground. 2013, well, we'll start to get the BIM outcomes. We want to get the tenders that are going out to make sure they're all level 2 compliant. And we'll start to, especially during the design and construct stages, start to validate BIM. Did we get the outcomes we said we would? And that's probably starting to pick some of the low-hanging fruit from the BIM outcome tree. 2014, well, we reckon that BIM should be the new norm in terms of the government, the central government projects. But we also reckon we'll probably start to hit a bit of turbulence in our flight plan at that place, because we start to think about level 3 full integration. And that's probably where the tricky questions have got to be answered, especially around about contracts and legals. So we know we're a bit off, but we've got a lot of work to do in terms of getting it right. But by 2015, we want to make sure that in terms of level 2, we are best in class in terms of the UK, that can start considering how we can export our skill base across to others. And there's no planned landing. It won't be a case of level 2's land and that's it, guys. You know, this will keep growing level 3 and beyond. And we've always got our compass pointing, if you like. Our north is always pointing towards integration. We start off at collaboration, but we're always driving towards that ultimate goal of having the integrated project. And well, what does this all kind of look like? When we started the journey, we said, let's try and plot it out. And I remember sitting one Sunday with a bit of paper saying, this is what I think it looks like. You know, it's a bit wow, but let's try and sort of deconstruct it, spend a couple of minutes thinking, what does this look like? Well, I think the unique part is it doesn't start on the left-hand side, it actually starts on the right. We start very much with the end in mind. What do I need as a client? What data set do I need that's going to help me maintain that building in terms of FM? What data can I also provide? You know, maybe I've got my 3D laser scan, I'm sure I've got objects, there's things that I can provide, but I've also got to ask the question where BIM is going to be useful for me during the project life cycle, and how do I get the asset I need? So we're starting to, if you like, formulate in terms of briefing what we need as a client. And from that, the first thing we're going to do is kind of have a client BIM briefing plan that's going to start to schedule out the BIM project success matrix and the questions that we want BIM to answer for us during the whole project life cycle. And what that starts to do, it starts to give us consistent briefing and how we specify BIM. And by doing that, by answering questions, it's actually going to start to determine what the level of detail looks like for the model. It's about the benefits realization. What do we want at the end of this job in terms of an asset? And we think setting targets is a good thing. It helps, you know, focus the project team to start to understand what we want, and we can start to measure what makes that great project. We start to move down, if you like. Industry starts to respond. How do we achieve what the client asked us to do? And we see, if you like, a method statement type approach. We'll have a template, and we'll ask how you're going to govern the model, what your standards are going to look like, how you're going to measure it, what's your performance metrics going to be, how you're going to collaborate around about the model, and how you're going to start to drive performance from it, and how you're going to make that safe by design, how you're going to start to validate for us and make sure your data set is all linked up. Lesson we've learned from America, people don't always tell the truth. We've got to make sure that we validate and tick in the box before it starts to move on. We'll then, if you like, start to build the model, and then, if you like, the model starts to flow with data. It starts to get infused with lots of information that at certain points at the moment, we're seeing 4 key drops that will start to answer questions for us. It may be around affordability, it may be around energy performance, that starts to validate your business case. Down the bottom, you'll start to see the layer that starts to build up as the data gets. The COBE data set is going to be the key data set in all projects. On top of that, there'll be a unique client layer of data that might be specific for a project or for a department. But COBE, if you like, the reason for it, the lowest common denominator, it can go on to Excel or whatever, so there's no technology investment. We'll also see in terms of these data drops, as well as answering the questions, being a check by the FM teams to make sure they can get an asset that can be maintained. And it will be an iterative process. As we fail or go back, it will keep pushing right through. But we want to create that single data currency as well. We mentioned, if you like, maybe not the euro, but we want to make sure, if you like, that we can have an asset code that marries our COBE data set and our asset geometry right the way through. And what we've learned already is a small amount of data can answer quite a lot of questions for us. This is the whole concept, if you like, of macro BIM. I think we've been guilty already at trying to put too much data into models at the outset that don't really give us the value. Let's make sure that the data answers the fundamental question, and maybe in terms of Lego, that's the Duplo blocks, if you like. You start to go further up the journey, the more objects, the more the level of detail in the model, the more detailed questions it's going to start to answer for you at those data drops. And it will get to the point where it's very much to the level of detail, is almost up to that point of fabrication. I think Lego's always got a great analogy. Then we get to the point, the next point is we start to think about the FM data set. And I think we've been guilty, and I know we've been guilty, of dropping the baton between the construction and the FM. And what we're starting to see, it's taken at least a year from finishing a project to actually getting closure, starting to get all that information you need to start running in terms of that O&M data set. And that causes real problems for our clients in terms of how they can run efficiently. And that's the soft FM landing we talked about. So what we're trying to do is kind of harvest the data. How do we take it seamlessly from the design and construction stage right through into that asset information model. And that's what the next part is. You know, we moved, if you like, from the red to the green. And this is the big question for client. I've suddenly got all this data. Where do I start to put it? How do I now maintain it for the next 30, 40 years? I'll put it into a system, and this is level 2. Every time I make a change, I've got to make sure I can marry it up to my geometry and my data set. But we want to, and we know there's real value in level 2, that clients can start to make decisions about the effectiveness of whole life cycle and how they run that building from the data set. And what we're starting to see already is it's a feedback loop. Next time around, you've got a better data set. That means you can brief it better as you go around. So, you know, you've heard the story. What have you got to do now in terms of making it ready, if in terms of ready, steady, go? Well, for me, we were talking about it at departments last week, and we think it's kind of like getting ready for a wedding in terms of what do I have to do before I can launch that BIM project. And we kind of came up with, well, you've got to think about certain things. And I think for the people today, think, what does BIM mean to you? I mean, BIM can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and they're not always wrong. Start asking, and we ask the same thing to departments, where's BIM going to bring you value in terms of what you do? If you're a designer, if you're a client, if you're a subcontractor, the value proposition is going to be different. Understand where it is with you, and also look, where's going to bring your clients value? It's different, you know, you two ends of the scale, start to think about where that's going to be for you. And then start to put a commercial overlay for it. Don't ask how much is BIM going to cost me, but start looking what's the return on my investment for BIM. How much can this improve my performance? And try to think, how is it going to start driving efficiency for your business? You know, we mentioned having that model in itself doesn't drive efficiency. How can you integrate around about the model and start being more productive? The big question is, how can BIM start to help you win work as well? Well, we're starting to see already better visualizations. Clients start to understand the construction, the design intent, and start to think about the questions you want BIM to answer for you in terms of your business process. And probably the big one down at the bottom is what behaviors you've got to change within your organization to make it real. The big thing as well, start to think about your BIM outcomes in terms of business strategy. This is about transformational change, and it's about people driving change. And I think one of the first things I could say is make sure you've got these agents for change in the business, the people that really want to make this happen, not the people, well, we'll be doing this for the 20, 30 years. And how do you do that? Well, one of the things I would say is you've got to start creating that community of practice. Join the dots, start to raise awareness of what BIM means to you, having worked it out and where you're going with your journey. And start to understand your capability. Where am I at? Be realistic, and where's the supply chain? How do I start to get them ready for the journey too? And probably the reality is they're going to need your help to get there. One of the first things we've seen, though, is you do need to plan for BIM. You know, start putting an execution plan together to say what you want to get from it. Socialize it, communicate it, so your designer, your contractor knows what the outcomes are. They're all aligned. And make sure that the level of detail that you want at the key points is defined as well. And what we know already, if there's no explicit plan, no thought in terms of what level of detail you want in the model, it becomes a real big mess, and you don't get the outcomes that you think you are. Train, you do have to train people up, not just in terms of the technology side, but in terms of that collaborative side as well. How are you going to use BIM to drive productivity? Learn from others. There's people, especially in the US, Finland, that have been driving this on, and definitely other industries as well, lots of lessons. And think about technologies in terms of outcome-based. What do you want to get from your technology? In most cases, we find people just need a 3D design review tool. You know, there doesn't need to always be the big investment. Just think what outcome and drive it back the way from what you want to get from your technologies. Give some thought to COBE, the construction operation, building information exchange. That's going to be the data set, if you like, the golden line right the way through all our projects. And start to think about your object library as well. Is there any objects that you can start to create to give to your designers to start putting into the models? I think you've also got to measure BIM success. I think this is key to it as well. We see projects at this moment in time say, we're more efficient. Well, I think the reality is supply chain has just generally got sharper pencils. So we've got to understand where we're getting efficiencies for, start to measure it, and maybe a case of RFIs, requests for information, the number of drawings, the amount of contingency you realised on it, but start to measure it and start to put the case studies together. And I know in terms of government, that's going to be key to the programme. You've got to start identifying your pilot projects, start to manage them well, start to build your own pipeline. You know, try and get up to, by 2016, where you've got to be. BIM maturity, we said this is like a series of stepping stones, might be the small outcomes first, start to build up, learn from that capability, learn from lessons. and start thinking about your process through the whole project lifecycle. We worked with departments last week and we said, do you have a process that takes you from one end to the other? And largely what you find, everybody's in their little silos. Try and make sure your process goes right the way through that whole project lifecycle and understand your key decision points as well. And we go back to what's the cost of not doing it? Well, I think as we mentioned, if you can't, it's not about doing BIM, but if you can't start to offer these new value propositions, be more efficient in what you do, the reality is there's a chance that, as Paul Morrell says, you could really be beta-maxed out of the competition. And I think there's a lot of scaremongering in there, extinctions await firms who ignore BIM. And I think it's real, but I think, we've got a real opportunity in terms of leadership. Clients have got an expectation of us to rise to this challenge, if you like. It's kind of what's expected. As we say the UK is the best construction economy, well, let's go now and improve it. Let's actually take BIM as part of our path. We think, well, what's the future of BIM? Well, I think by 2020, we'll start to see really, really, really big BIM, where it's about starting to bring interdependencies together, starting to link data sets, if you like, starting to bring that integration through the whole project life cycle. It's not about the Internet of Things. What happens if I can tie the data set for my traffic lights up with cities? You start to get to make some massive decisions about how you govern cities and how you run them. And I think we will see that data explosion. I think it's projected 24 billion devices are going to be linked together through RFI technology. We'll start to see the intelligent buildings. We're seeing them in the US already. And I'm sure by 2020, we'll start to see the first digital cities through linked data. But if we don't do it, is this game over? Is it game over for the construction industry? I think we could be. I think that's either that or we've got the opportunity to really start to reset the default. So you've heard the story. And at this point, we'll get Sean up to help facilitate some questions and answers.